You've entered Bookstorm with Kristen Civiletto and me, Chris Storm. This is a podcast devoted to best-selling books that matter, books that make a difference. We're diving down deep with beloved authors about their stories. We're exposing hot-button topics and heartfelt themes, the issues that affect each of us in our own lives, as siblings, parents, partners, friends, as human beings. We're braving new ideas, fresh thoughts, hard lessons, and important truths. Those kinds of things that stay with us long after we turn the last page and close the book. Welcome back to Bookstorm Podcast. We're very excited about the book that we have here with us today and the amazing author. It's a historical, and we love historicals. And we have the author Aimie Runyan with us today. Aimie K. Runyan. Welcome, Aimie.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Aimie has happened upon an amazing story. The book is called Mademoiselle Eiffel. Do you want me to say Eiffel or the correct Kristen was saying Eiffel, or how do you like us? Eiffel. You want to say Eiffel? Okay, that is fancy. Now that you said that, I will never be able to pronounce it correctly. I'm just going to give you a warning. That's how I always work. Anyway, we just loved it. A little glimpse of history that we didn't know about, but have now grown to love. And before we get started, I want to tell our listeners a little bit about you. From your earliest years, I see on your bio that you loved jotting down stories and supposedly really bad poetry. I don't believe it. You've been a writer at heart since you were little. At 33 years old, 7 years of marriage, 2 children, you wrote your first novel.
I did.
Then you changed genres slightly and moved into the emotionally charged world of women's fiction. We're so happy you did. I see that you taught French to high schoolers with occasional stints in English, public speaking, and competitive forensics. That sounds interesting. Right now, when you're not writing or wrangling your, I like you say, wayward kiddos, you enjoy hiking, baking, sewing, music, theater, everything that goes into the nerd culture. Yes, Kristen and I are right there with you. These are things we love too. Readers, we're all pulled together. And you're also a member of the Tall Poppy Writers, the Rocky Mountain Fiction Writers, Pikes Peak Writers, and the Women's Fiction Writers Association. Wonderful. I do have to quote a friend of Bookstorm, Kristen Harmel, of course, the New York Times bestselling writer, also of some historical fiction. She says this book is a fascinating tale of a woman ahead of her time and will leave a mark on your heart. Yes, Kristen, we absolutely agree. Welcome to Bookstorm.
Love her.
Love her.
Yeah.
Well, Aimie, of course, we're here to talk about your release. We just love it. Mademoiselle Eiffel. And we pronounce it in America as Eiffel, as in the Eiffel Tower, but we're going to go ahead with the actual pronunciation. I like to give our listeners a little bit of what's going on in the story without giving away, any spoilers, of course. And if you want to add anything at the end, we would love it if you did that. But this is just, first of all, a beautiful cover. I want to show this cover again. It is lovely. Now,
they did such a great job. They
did
such
beautiful.
A great job.
Beautiful. Now, in this story, we meet Claire. She is the brilliant oldest daughter of a very famous architect, and that is Gustave Eiffel, who designed many things, among them the Eiffel Tower. Now, she lives in an upper class existence. There are many children in the family. They are educated, and things change very abruptly when she loses her mother. And Claire is put into the situation where she needs to step into that role and not only raise those children, but also manage a very significant household. She begins to really prove her competence. She starts to travel a bit with her father. She learns that business, she knows things. And at some point in the story, we see where an up-and-coming protege of Gustave's moves into that role of becoming her father's confidant. Now, this is a little distressing to Claire at first, and they have a rocky relationship, and his name is Adolphe. And between them, things begin to spark and to grow. And so we trace this family as they navigate these significant changes, as they start to wrestle with their legacy, especially when some difficult things come into the family business. But we just loved seeing how Claire and Adolf negotiate these changes. Oh, did you want to add anything to that background on the story?
Oh, well, that's a wonderful summary. I think that the tension between Claire, who has been her father's, right-hand woman for about 7 years before Adolf enters the scene, she really resents him at first, and that animosity and the evolution of their relationship, I thought it was fascinating. And of course, it's hard to know, how Claire felt about Adolf, because they were together a lot. There is not a lot of correspondence between the two of them, but there's kind of a logical pattern to in my brain, how their relationship would have gone, simply because of the dynamics of the family. And so, of course, it's historical fiction. And so I can't know, the most intimate moments of anyone's marriage outside of my own. But it was really fascinating to dig inside her skull and try and figure out what she was thinking and feeling throughout this, banner moment in history.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
That is the beauty of historical fiction, that we're actually learning some truth here.
Mhm.
And you're weaving it into a beautiful story and introducing us to someone that truly existed and made differences in the world. I really loved this story that I felt speaks to women empowerment in a way.
Mm-hmm.
Claire, Mademoiselle Eiffel, do I have that right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, was forced to make sacrifices at the young age of 14 when no child should have been forced to make them. She had talents and skills that she wasn't able to use because she was a girl, a woman. Yet we saw Claire utilize the rights she did have back in that era, the ability to make decisions about her household, the ability to help her father and her husband in their business, the ability to control her responses, I noted. And we grew to love her. What drew you, I had to ask, as the author, towards this particular woman in history? I feel like she taught us some lessons that we can still use today.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I was researching for book ideas after I'd finished A Bakery in Paris, which takes place, it's a dual timeline, but one of the two timelines is in 1870, and it's a period of great upheaval in France. It's the period of the Paris Commune, and there was the siege of Paris by the Prussians in 1870 and the Commune in 1871. And it was, it was a really, really hard period in history. There was, great privation and everything. But then it was the end of the monarchy. It was basically the end of the French Revolution. And I loved, down to the marrow of my bones, writing A Bakery in Paris. And I wanted to do something to follow on to show what Paris was going through less than 10 years later, 9 years later or so. And even it starts, not even that far after, 7 years, 6 or 7 years, it starts. And it's the beginning of the Belle Époque, the beautiful period, where, the monarchy has been set aside. France is deciding who it wants to be, who she wants to be as a country. And it really is a beautiful period of enlightenment, of artistic growth, of, obviously great advances in technology. And they have the Great Expo of 1889 demonstrated a working automobile, and Thomas Edison showed up, as you will have seen in the book. And it really was, just this pivotal moment in history. And so when I was looking for book ideas, wanting to stay kind of in Belle Époque France, I came across the story of Claire Eiffel, and I was just absolutely fascinated at this woman who had to, my daughter's 11, and she is mature and she is capable of great things. She's a little powerhouse, and who is taller than I am, but little powerhouse. And I can't imagine what it would be like for her to be put under that level of strain in just 3 years' time. And so when I read that, I was, transported into my daughter's brain and how hard it would be to take over. And so when I presented the idea originally to my editor, it was going to be like kind of comparing and contrasting the seedy underbelly of the Moulin Rouge with Claire Eiffels' story. And she's like, no, just focus on Claire. And so she was absolutely right. There was plenty of grist to write an entire book about Claire. And I'm glad I did, because her story, I've not found, I'm honestly, the amount of research, nonfiction research about Gustav himself is actually less than one might think for somebody who is such an influential figure in French history. Has to do a little bit with the Panama Canal scandal, I would largely think. But I mean, he's also important in American architecture because he built the structure for the Statue of Liberty. And so that Claire story is untold is not all that shocking. I don't know. I think there might be one novel about her in German, but I have not seen a lot of work or any work about her in English. So it was very exciting to tap into something new and exciting. And so my editor, my wonderful editor, Tessa Woodward at William Morrow, got excited about it, and we went off to the races. So it was great.
Well, we're glad you did.
Yeah. Thank you.
Aimie, I agree. I think it was such an unexplored area, and you got that sense when you were reading the story. So it kept you turning those pages. I really loved the friendship that you had between Claire and Ursule, her friend. And at one point, Ursule writes to her, and this is a quote: "Even great men make mistakes, and usually to scale with the proportion of their greatness. And the women in their lives must pay the price along with them." Now, this was such an important statement about the role of women who helped great men succeed throughout history. So I wanted to ask you about that quote. And, can you expand a little bit upon that idea?
Well, women's future, as we know, especially prior to the 1970s in the United States, women's futures were, and their futures, their well-being, everything was tied to the man they married. And being a spinster was really not a viable option for most women unless they had, financial resources to remain independent. And that was incredibly hard to do. As we all know, credit cards or bank accounts even were hard to secure, or any sort of loan was almost impossible to secure without the permission of a male relative. And so the fact that, if a husband, made a poor business decision, his wife suffered. I mean, there wasn't the set, as we have, we all suffer ups and downs. You'll notice that a lot of novelists are married to people with really stable careers. I'm married to a tenured professor. Bless his heart for, we'll always have health insurance. And there's that stability. But we don't, this is not an era where you have dual incomes unless a person is coming from great wealth and they've got generational wealth built up, which was not the case here. Gustav came from, self-made. His dad was kind of a self-made man. And so they had some money, but Gustav really was more or less a self-made man, or self-made man with a little boost, but, not beyond the average, upper middle class kid. So not nothing, but not everything, we'll say. And so, a great line was from Mrs. Maisel, when the wife character, her husband up and quits his job as a tenured professor, and her future is, her husband made a terrible decision, or what, at the time felt like a really terrible decision. And she had to suffer the consequences along with him, because it wasn't her place to question his decision. She wasn't involved in that process, but, they lost their apartment. It's kind of the same thing here, in that, if Gustav lost his entire fortune and his home and everything else, it would affect Claire directly, because she is, dependent on his good fortunes to maintain the life that she has. And that whole notion of women's forced dependency really rang true, despite the fact that she's an incredibly, independent-minded woman. She is forced into a certain amount of dependency that had to be very uncomfortable for her. But, not in the sense, I mean, she probably wouldn't have given it as much thought as we would nowadays, simply because that was the reality for women. And she might have thought it was terrible, but, this is not, the great moment of, women's liberation. for sure, probably, the earliest sparks of a women's suffrage movement. And France was very late to the women's suffrage movement, 1945. So this is not a very forward thinking country in terms of women's rights. We think of France and, now as being incredibly enlightened, but it was very slow to recognize the equal rights of women. And I think that she would have been a woman ahead of her time, but not in the 1960s rah-rah feminist sort of way.
Yeah, and I loved how you mentioned too that it's not just a financial dependence, their societal standing really rose
Mhm.
and fell with their husband's reputation. And that's why this reputational harm that you explored in the story was so interesting to me. Because
Yep.
you're right, you do hitch your wagon to whatever happens with your spouse at this time as women.
Yep.
Very
It's
interesting.
absolutely true.
I just want to say for our listeners, I don't think that you portrayed Gustav when the wife died as being abusive to Claire, but more that he needed her. But was there also a little glimpse that he saw something special in her? He
Oh,
believed that
absolutely. Yeah. She was the kid that was allowed to stay in the library with him and read a book. And, because she knew the rules, you save your questions until your dad, you don't disturb dad. I mean, you think about what he's doing as an architecture. She's working on sketches or something at home. Um, a screwed up calculation can make the building fail, right? So, she understands the assignment in that she has to give him absolute quiet, but he's kind of always appreciated her vibe, her presence in the room. And so she was allowed to hang out in the library while he was working and read quietly and hold any questions she might have until he had a break or what have you. And they've always had that kind of father-daughter rapport that he never brokered with his sons, who were little, and that's taken absolutely from the historical record. Because it wasn't, it was not Eiffel and Sons, it was Eiffel et Compagnie, Le Compagnie Eiffel. And yeah, it was, they had a special bond. And when you read the correspondence between Claire and her father, and of course, not during a lot of the correspondence isn't during a vast portion of when the book takes place, because they were together. And so because they were, 2 months after her mom died, he had her on a train to Portugal. And that was, where she contracted her fatal illness too. So there wasn't a lot of letter exchanging between the two of them until after she was married, and they were spending more time apart, and he was quasi-retired. But the level of respect that he imbued in his letters included little sketches in the margins to talk to her about his ideas. He spoke to her like an equal, but there was also a tremendous amount of affection in the language that they used toward one another. That it's typical, she's definitely the quintessential daddy's girl. And he realized that she was organized and responsible and brilliant. And he knew that he had to lean on her, and he could trust her more than he could anybody in his employ, because she's not compelled to say yes when the answer is no. And that's what he respects about her.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I just want to switch it up a little bit and talk about
Sure.
this beautiful Tower Eiffel, who most of us have been there. It's magnificent. I thought it was so interesting, though, that at that time, there was a lot of fear surrounding the building of this tower by the local Parisians, and also criticism as a matter of taste from the architects.
Oh,
And
sure.
ultimately, people were attracted to the tower, according to your book, in the long run. And I like when Claire said this. Claire believed the tower was that the tower was not to be humbled by its magnificence, but to be elevated into greatness along with it. Wow.
Mhm.
That showed me that she had a keen insight into architecture in building. The reader understood that change, even progressive, is important, but it's always accompanied by some type of skepticism. Is there a lesson in this for all of us today to never relinquish our ambitions and our dreams despite criticism?
Oh, absolutely. I think that criticism is a necessary part. I mean, look at what I do for a living. I open myself up to criticism every day of the week and twice on Sunday. And it's just the nature of the beast when you do anything innovative or creative or artistic. And architecture is all of those things. And the Great Expo of 1889 was meant to be is the centennial of the French Revolution, and it was meant to signify how far France had evolved as a country in the past 100 years, and it was meant to be a tribute to progress. The problem being that France at its heart is, there's a love for the tradition, there's a love for the classicism, there's a love of the way things have always been done, and the old guard. And it used to be that the Louvre was this mausoleum of ancient art, and only the brilliant few who were blessed by the powers that be were able to display their art in the Louvre. And that the Musée d'Orsay was really the subversive kind of you can think of kind of the counterculture movement with impressionism versus realism, or classicism, where you had absolute representationalism in the art. And they thought that we think of Monet, and we think of Cézanne, who's actually a post-impressionist. We think of their work as being quaint and pastoral and beautiful, and it was so subversive. It was so subversive. And this is really meant to be a tribute to the future, and France struggles with that. But we think about advances in modern technology, and yes, we have to give them pause. Like we have the growth of AI, and we're living in the midst of a climate crisis where we're all being told to not. And I live up in the mountains, so I don't have air conditioning, but never set your thermostat below 78 unless you're actively dying. And we've got AI that's eating up all this that nobody really wants, eating up all this tremendous amount of electricity as a to make that point somehow seem even more ridiculous. And so yes, we have to be critical of new technologies, and we have to look at things with a jaded eye, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't progress forward with a level of skepticism, healthy skepticism. I'm no Luddite. I love technology and things like that, but I think that making the steps forward in a way that makes sense, in a way that is thoughtful, and that is that makes that allows for progress, but with a sense of intelligence and forethought is the right way forward. And I think that that's what Gustave was trying to do, because radio was really a technology that was beginning to boom in 1889. And the Eiffel Tower at its core was meant to be the world's most powerful radio tower. And it is still, high up on that list. And it was vital in World War I, which is part of the reason it still stands today, and increasingly vital in World War II, etc. And it became, that office, Gustave's office became a laboratory of sorts for his scientific experimentation, and a vital part of the scientific community for decades while he still lived. And now it's a museum. There is a lovely wax figure of Gustave sitting nice and casually in his chair, and Thomas Edison with a knee, legs casually slung over his knee, in deep conversation. And Claire, there's a blonde woman standing in the back looking ready to serve them coffee or what have you. And it's Claire. And people probably wonder who in the heck this woman is, and this wax figure is. And it's this little quiet freight train from history, Claire, who was responsible for the great for that meeting. She was there at the great meeting. There was about a dozen other people in that office as well, where they had a luncheon in Gustave's office, and she was there with them. And the thing that they don't include in the wax figure is that she was about 9.5 months pregnant. She was ready to pop. And they did not make the wax figure look as though she were expecting, but she was absolutely there and in attendance, despite her delicate condition, ready to make sure that the meal went off without a hitch, because that was her job.
Wow. It's also interesting. Thank you for bringing it to us.
Absolutely.
Mm.
Amy, I want to ask you about another theme that kind of caught my attention in this
Sure.
story. Claire really, she often contemplated the what ifs. What if she had, pursued a different course in her life, maybe art, or she'd married somebody different? Um, what if her mother had lived longer? These were things she often thought about. And I think we all ask ourselves those types of questions from time to time. And I wanted to ask you if you thought that was productive for her to do that, or if it was a way for her to start visualizing what women can do and other things that were possible at the time.
I think the what if machine is a dangerous thing. We all play that game, and it is a fun form of self-torture at times. What if I'd chosen a different major in college? What if I'd taken this opportunity instead of the other opportunity? We can second guess ourselves. But I think that her situation lent itself, and it was necessary for her healing. And the question, what if my mother had lived
Yeah.
and she'd been permitted to have a complete childhood, is something that it would have been impossible for her to move forward without contemplating, at least on occasion. She was a busy woman. She was a mother of three. She probably didn't have a lot of time to dither over it, but I can't imagine that scenario didn't cross her mind in quiet moments more often than not. Um, because it removed the element of choice in her life. Her path was set on a trajectory, and she might have had option A and B to choose from, but rarely option C, D, E, and F. And the way that she might have done had her mother lived, or if she had not felt the same level of obligation to her father and perhaps married somebody else, or if she had thought to, maybe if she dug in her heels and insisted on, working in a more serious manner with the company fell, which would have been really, really hard for her to manage. Emily Roebling in America, who helped build the Brooklyn Bridge, was kind of a special case because her husband was incapacitated. But Claire wouldn't have been permitted to get the training she needed to become a full architect. But I can't imagine, imagine thinking, what if I'd been born a boy? And, what if, my brothers wouldn't have had to worry about falling into dad's shoes? Maybe they wouldn't have become the ne'er-do-wells that they did, because they wouldn't have had this burden of, the crown prince ascending to the throne.
Yeah.
So and she, of course, is always going to wonder, have I done right by the other kids? She's the oldest of five. I don't think we mentioned that. She has two brothers and two sisters. Her sisters were charming, lovely women. They got married fairly young to good young men. Her brothers took a while to figure their stuff out, but they did eventually, lead happy, productive lives. But they had no desire to become architects, and that's not a job that you can just, do half-heartedly. It's a job that you have to have a tremendous amount of training, and it requires precision that if you're not invested fully, you just won't be able to do it. And unfortunately, Gustav realized very early on that his sons were never going to be equal to the task, and he had to secure his legacy, which is, it's a huge theme of the book, is Gustav's legacy and
Mhm.
its importance to every single person in that book.
Yeah. Well, it's one of the things that I really enjoyed about this story because, on some level, the things she was wrestling with, they're the same issues that we're wrestling with today, especially as women, and
Mhm.
thinking about our role in a family and our family's legacy and, opportunities for work or other enjoyable activities. How do we balance all of that? So,
Exactly.
very, very beautiful. Well, I'm going to show our listeners and our watchers on YouTube this beautiful cover once again. We know that people are going to love this story. We have loyal listeners in 89 countries, Amy. So I think you're
That's
going to
amazing.
not hear criticism and hear a lot of people enjoying this wonderful, wonderful book. And I want to tell our listeners how to connect with you. You have a beautiful website, Aimie Runyan, and it's aimiekrunyan.com. And I want to spell it for our listeners, AIMIE RUNYAN.com. You have a newsletter. And before you go, we were just wondering if you could maybe share with us what is on your radar. What are you doing next?
Oh gosh. So as you know, that I also write contemporary women's fiction that is basically travel and food escapist fiction. My previous work was The Memory of Lavender and Sage. It's kind of a year in Provence meets Under the Tuscan Sun, with some modern twists and a little bit of magical realism. But in April, my second contemporary novel, which is called The Wandering Season, will come out, and it's a story about a woman who had recently, coming fresh out of a breakup, comes home for Christmas here in Estes Park, Colorado. I get to write about my hometown for a chapter or two. And she gets a DNA test for Christmas that doesn't go all that well. And she ends up going to Europe to explore the places where her ancestors came from, to unexpected results. And she
Ooh.
is a food matchmaker. This is the coolest job ever. She is called, her business is called the Kitchen Muse, and she likes to pair high-end artisans and people who create amazing like specialty products, cheese makers, and also farmers, with art, gourmet grocery stores, and of course restaurants. And so she brings them together, and she's kind of like a restaurant consultant as well. And her business is kind of, she's helping other people fulfill her dreams, and spinning her wheels a little bit. And she uses the trip to kind of figure out what the next step is for Veronica Stratton. And so it's been a joy to write. We're in copy edits right now.
Excellent.
And so that'll be out on April 1st.
Well,
Sounds
we hope that
great.
yes, it does. We hope that you come back
Oh,
to talk
absolutely.
about that book with us. Actually, we'd like to come to you. I was just in Estes Park this year, and what an amazing place. And I saw elk in the middle of your town square.
Oh yeah. Yeah, they'll walk around the McDonald's
They
drive-through. I'm amazed they don't order. It's crazy. It's crazy.
Aw, well, how wonderful. Well, thank you again for this beautiful book and for coming on our show to
Just loved
discuss
it.
it.
What a
Loved it.
Thank you
great
so
discussion.
much.
Thank you so much. Loved it.
Bye-bye, Amy.
Bye.
And Kristen, this is why I love historical fiction, because you're being told an entertaining story, but we're learning something true about the past. And this is no exception. It's a wealth of information in this book. It hit me when Claire had the loss of her mother and the constant pain of facing her life alone. She thought about it all the time. And of course she had her father, but that was one very personal aspect to Claire's life that I feel we could all relate to, with the loss of a loved one, and especially someone who loses a parent as a child. I mean,
Yeah.
how do you get, you maybe, like you said, you always wonder, what if?
Well, yeah, and that always caused her too to start weighing the choices that she's made in her life, which we do that every day. Many of us, at least I do. And thinking about how there's some constants, family, maybe another parent to be there to support that family's legacy, her own desires and interests and ambitions. We from throughout time, women have had to really weigh those things. And here we had such an interesting glimpse of what was going on societally. It was, I think, a fascinating time in history. I agree with Amy. And I know you and I always end up talking about that period in history for some reason or another. So that was pretty cool. That was a great part of the story.
In the other sad part to Claire's story was her grandmother was very tough on her and almost did not want Claire to move into any male roles or positions or any extra responsibility. And I just thought, wow, do we still do that today? Do some of us say we don't want to move forward in a society? We don't want minorities or marginalized people to have a voice. We don't want women to be able to do more than what we've allowed. And is it always our seniors? Sometimes seniors just want to stay with the status quo. They're comfortable where they are. But maybe it's not just grandmothers in today's world. Maybe it's lots of different people. But I grew to dislike her grandmother. Did you?
Oh yeah, she was deliciously nasty. So it was an interesting part of that whole family dynamic. We didn't have a chance to get into that with Amy. I was wondering if that was reflective of reality or if that was more of a fiction. But yeah, that was pretty interesting.
That's a little teaser. And then one last thing, because architecture plays such a huge role here in what the Eiffel Tower stood for, more than just being a beautiful piece of work. They also talked about the bridge in Porto that he was building. And they said this about it: the effect was quite elegant, despite the increased number of supports, almost feminine, while adding strength to the structure at the same time. Grace and strength aren't contradictory terms, but rather synonymous. Wow. Is that some kind of a crazy symbolism towards a female?
Yeah,
Grace and strength can go together. I loved that.
absolutely. In fact, we can't give anything away, but the structure and the way that Gustave laid out the Eiffel Tower was a very interesting tribute as well to women. And I'm going to leave our listeners hanging on that one because you got to read the book to kind of hear where that came into play. But absolutely. Well, we loved having Aimie. We want to tell you listeners who we have coming up because we have some additional wonderful authors, some fantastic books. Our summer is jam packed. Listen to this: Preston and Child, Angel of Vengeance, Jamie Brenner, A Novel Summer, Jeffrey Deaver and Isabella Maldonado, Fatal Intrusion. That book kept me up last night. Brian Freeman for Robert Ludlum, The Born Shadow. Shelley Noble, The Colony Club. Amy Neff, The Days I Loved You Most. Jessica Strasser, Catch You Later. Fran Littlewood, Amazing Grace Adams. MP Woodward, writing for the Tom Clancy franchise, Shadow State. Lori Frankel with Family. Robert Dugoni, Beyond Reasonable Doubt. Michael Ledwidge, No Safe Place. And listeners, we've got you all over the world in 89 different countries and territories, all 50 states, 1,800 plus cities. We love it. We just ask that you continue to share our social media links so that we can spread the word about these deep conversations that we have with these incredible authors. We're thankful for you, and we love that you're joining and tuning in every week. So until next time, listeners, one of the best ways to brave the storm is to dive down deep into life-changing fiction.